Today gives me great pleasure to have with me a very experienced educationist, Christopher Short, who's the Managing Director of North Anglia Education in India. Welcome, Christopher, and thanks a lot for joining us today for this conversation. Really looking forward to have a scintillating conversation with you today.
Brilliant, thank you. No, it's an honor and a privilege to be here.
All right, great. All right, I think, Chris, before we jump into a question, so generally we cover a wide range of topics in these conversations, but I think it will be good for our audience to understand more about North Anglia and your role in particular. So I think if you can take us through your journey a little bit and touch upon what your current role is with North Anglia and the group as well, that would be a good starting point.
Okay, well, yeah, let me start with North Anglia. So North Anglia is over 50 years old, runs international schools in over 30 countries. We've got over 80 schools now across the world, headquartered out of London. So for those of you who know London, Victoria area. And then we have various regional offices around the world, and I'm sitting in one here in India, and we work with the India schools from this office here in Hyderabad. In terms of myself, I'm from the UK as well. I have an interesting heritage. I'm split between the very south of England and Scotland. So I spend my holidays going between the two. Luckily, Britain's not as big a country as in India, so it's not that difficult. And I've been working in international type education for the last 30 plus years. So started in the Middle East and then have worked through Southeast Asia, China, and now here in India. I've been with North Anglia for 12 years now. So I was working for schools in Vietnam when North Anglia acquired us. And then I went on to be principal of the school in Singapore. And then I went on to be executive superintendent of a bilingual school in Shanghai. And then I've been here in India for the last 2.5 years. And as I've sort of demonstrated, we've got schools around the world, and what possibly didn't come out of that is that each of our schools is very different. So, the school I was involved in running in Hanoi in Vietnam, we were the first British curriculum school in northern Vietnam. So we introduced the A-level and then the IB to the city. We had a mainly Vietnamese clientele to start with, and then it became more international over time. The school in Singapore, world renowned for its inclusivity. So, as well as getting mainstream students some stellar GCSE and IB results, we also had a world-renowned special stream. So we had students that wouldn't be in mainstream education in many countries, learning alongside students in a more regular setting. And then in China, relatively large bilingual school catering to the Chinese population, and again leading to the IB and then sending students on to international universities. And for me, that really sums up what North Anglia do very well, and actually sums up quite well what my role is here. We don't look to develop our 80 schools into sort of one homogenous model.
That's nice.
We look at schools and we look at the communities that they serve and the curriculum that they offer and the size and the facilities to a certain extent. And then we work to just make sure they're the best version of that for their communities. And essentially, that's my core role here. I work with our 5 schools to support the principals and the senior team to make sure that we can get those academic outcomes, and then we're operationally sound. We've got very high levels of health and safety, child safeguarding, making sure that we support the schools as best we can.
That's great, and it's an amazing career journey that you've had and continue to have, Chris, across various countries. And some of the strands that I picked up from your conversation and something that really stood out for me is that North Anglia is not, the vision is not to have one homogeneous kind of a school across the world, right? And this is where my second question comes up. Because in the last 5 to 6 years, we have seen many international school chains entering India, either in partnership with local schools and then bringing in their own curriculum, pedagogy, and there's an integration of sort that is happening. And so the question that keeps popping up, when I'm talking to parents or teachers, the question that they have is this: how is this changing the education system in India? Is it structurally making a difference there? And what are the pros and cons? So if you can, highlight, talk a little about it, that how these international school chains operate in local conditions and how they integrate with the local environment and the need of the stakeholders, because that varies across the regions and countries.
I think I think that's a good point. I sort of touched on it, some of that earlier. We do have to make sure that with any country we're operating in, that we're coming in and we're working with schools in a way that's in harmony with what the parent body want and what the student body want. It's a good example here. I mean, we've also us and other organisations have come in at a time when curricula such as GCSE and such as the IB are becoming much more popular, and they're being run by all sorts of schools within India. And I think I won't talk for the other companies so much, but certainly what I feel we offer is we offer obviously great experience in doing that. We're the IB's biggest private customer in the world, North Anglia Education, so that gives us a good relationship with the IB. And when we set schools up or we support schools that we've recently started working with, such as here in Oak Ridge with the schools in India, then we hit the ground running. We've got teams of people based in the UK or our regional colleagues here in Southeast Asia and India and the Middle East, which is the region we look after India from. And then we've also, in our case, we've got the connections. We've got some fantastic partnerships. So we've got a partnership with UNICEF in the States that our students can tap into. So we send students across to America every summer to get involved in an MUM program. We've got very good relationship with MIT, and again, they support our STEAM agenda, both sending students across to Boston, but also supporting projects within each of our schools. We've got training and research opportunities, partnerships. King's College in London support our master's program, so that our staff, we've currently got 5 of our staff here in India on that program. I get asked a lot by colleagues both here and in my previous places in North Anglia, what's that program like? And it's hard work, but fantastic is the feedback that every single person has given me, as you can imagine, doing a master's out of somewhere like King's College. We've got partnerships with Boston College around metacognition in terms of how people learn. And then we're working with Project Zero, which is a research centre affiliated to Harvard, around some of those skills that we're trying to develop in students that we know they need to get on in life. So there's the sort of the practical day-to-day experience and support that we can give, and then there's the opportunities that scale brings, to be honest. That's one of the reasons why as a schools organisation, we've never been scared of growing, because as we grow, we can it then makes it much easier to find these partnerships and work with these partners, and therefore enriching the lives of all of our students in all of our schools.
And that's great. And that perfectly makes sense, because that is what a true international education means, right? That is when students across the world can leverage the power of connections and network of universities, of organizations, and build their skill set, their career, and build the best version of themselves. So that sounds, I think that's what you are talking about, Chris,
yeah,
right?
Definitely. And only next week, the 40 of us are going to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi, I apologise. We're flying through Dubai, hence the confusion. So we're going to one of our 2 schools in Abu Dhabi for a conference with about 200 teachers from across the region. And a fantastic opportunity. I took a group of colleagues to Kuala Lumpur in December for a similar conference on the admin side. These are all opportunities for our colleagues to make connections, to learn from other schools, and to bring that experience back here, and as I say, make the experience for our students even more enriched.
You got it. And let me ask a different question now. So as the Managing Director for North Anglia Education in India, what are the challenges that you face? I understand that there's a lot of the power of scale that you're bringing to bear when it comes to uplifting of the school pedagogy in India. But what are some of the challenges, Chris, that you face when running operations in this country?
I'm not sure there's too many that are specific to India. The normal challenges of running a big school and running the sets of schools. So, our schools vary in size in India from 700 students to 3,000 students, and even at 700, that's a challenge day in, day out of safely bringing every student in, running a good school day, having engaging teaching happening, and having many classrooms across the campus. I think what you said just at the beginning of that question is probably the key. We're obviously in 4 of our 5 schools. We're also running the CBSE curriculum and an international curriculum, whether that's the IB or GCSE. And that is something we need to prepare for. We need to make sure we've got the staff that have got the training, got the experience, and have got the interest in doing something different to maybe the way they were trained. Now, that's getting easier because more and more schools, as I said earlier, are doing the IB. So we do have staff come from other schools where they have that prior experience. And as I say, that's one of the great advantages of things like our teaching and learning conferences, because they will go to Abu Dhabi, for example, next week, and they will spend time with staff doing the same thing in other locations, and either learn through that weekend, or more likely just make those connections. So if they've got a question in a few weeks' time, they know who to contact. It's always much easier to connect with somebody. Despite our increased use of medium like this to talk to each other, it's still much better to actually have met people and know people before you then call them afterwards on Teams or Zoom or whatever it might be to do a follow-up.
Understood. Got it. And Chris, you have moved from classrooms to office room setting, right? So tell us, our audience, about this transition, because in my head, it's drastically different. I mean, the way a classroom and school setting is and the way an office setting is, it's like 2 ends of a spectrum. So how did you make that transition? And how do you feel about this transition? Do you miss going back to the schools and, being part of that buzzing activity?
That's a fascinating question, because that's something I think about an awful lot. So, I graduated from university in 1993, and did I think that I'd be sitting in an office environment in India 30-something years later? No, I didn't. I spent the first 10 years of my life happily doing teaching across my 2 subjects, which are chemistry and maths. I got very involved in guidance early on, university guidance. So that was the first 10 years of my career, which I absolutely loved. I set up the first work experience program in Dubai for expatriate children, and that was absolutely fascinating. That helped with my curiosity of the world. So, I got to visit students who were up the control tower in Dubai airport, and who were working in, boatyard in Ajman, for those that know the UAE, et cetera, et cetera. And it was just a fantastic opportunity. And then, and it's the same in many professions, but I think it's more pronounced in teaching. As you become more senior, your time in the classroom comes down, but it's still there. And then eventually, at some point, you work out that your role actually, takes you in and out of the school, especially if you work for an organisation, like ours, where you are involved in supporting other schools, or involved in quality assurance with other colleagues, and you do at certain points come out of the classroom, but while you're still based in a school, you've still got the energy. When I was in Singapore and I was in Shanghai, I was still at the front of the school every morning, greeting the students off the buses and saying hello and getting the energy. And my surname is Short, and for some reason, many children don't get that concept. So I'm known as Mr. Shorts, which is quite amusing, really. And so you do that, and you teach when you can, whether that's taking over a lesson for an absent colleague or just being around. I used to have lunch with the grade 1 students when I was in Shanghai every Monday, and that was such a humbling experience, as they tried to teach me a little bit of Mandarin Chinese. And, they're going seamlessly between 2 languages, and you're fumbling around in one language. And then one day, you suddenly find yourself in an office environment, and you're thinking, right, this is a bit strange, because it's all very quiet, and
it's too silent.
There isn't the movement. You can hear the AC. You can go out for lunch, and you generally don't get disturbed. And it is an alien environment to me. And 2.5 years in, I still have to get into schools. My wife tells me she knows when I've not been in school for a while, because I start to become a little bit grumpy, and I haven't had that energy of going in. So I spend at least one day a week. We've got 2 schools in Hyderabad, so I spend at least one day a week in a school, and then I travel to the other schools and spend a little bit more time, concentrated time, every couple of months or so, and that provides that balance. I've had some fantastic meetings with like our student council bodies or our head students. They've pitched ideas to me. North Anglia has a big push around social impact. We have grants that we award student bodies for them to spend, and have an impact on their local community. And so, I do get involved in that and just love that. I mean, I've had some more. I've probably had the most probing questions from the student councils here, whether that's around us as an organisation and how we support the schools, or whether that's about their project and what they want to get out of it, than I've had anywhere else. It's just been blown away by the student bodies that we have within our 5 schools.
No, I totally, relate to when you say that you still need to go to these schools so that you're not, you feed on that energy and you're not grumpy anymore. Because some 7-8 years back, when I was with Oak Ridge Schools as their VP Academic Operations, every week I used to be at schools. And it's such a great experience to be there. I think you just feel young being surrounded by teachers and students. And I remember one day, Bangalore principals, Mr. Arjun Rao, he told me that if the school is too quiet, that means something is wrong. So noise is good.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I think it's good. And I mean, I have the same conversation with the colleagues here. The colleagues that I work with in the office, obviously their roles vary from being, quite hands-on within the schools if they're operational, but some of our finance people, maybe their role doesn't involve them going into schools. But, we encourage all our staff to go into school. We're very close to one of our schools, and we're not that far from the other one in Hyderabad. So, I'd encourage them all to go in and pick up on that. Obviously, many of our colleagues are parents, so they're there as a parent. They have a shared interest, obviously, in our schools doing well. But no, it is a unique environment. So it's always the question I ask whenever I interview people when I've been working in schools for a school position, but a non-teaching position, and somebody's new to working in schools, I always say to them after they've been there a few weeks, how have you found this? And they all pick up on the energy, they all pick up on the dynamism, they all pick up on the passion, to be honest. Teachers go into teaching because it's something they believe in. I'm not saying we're the only profession that does that, but it's something that is tangible in good schools.
Yes, it's a tangible purpose that they feel. I have one question. You mentioned that you still interact with student bodies and they have really tough questions or challenging questions for you. Any particular conversation with students that left you stuck, that you struggled to answer, or you really had to think through to give them a very meaningful answer? Any conversation that you would like to talk about?
I think, and this is probably why I said what I said earlier. The first time I went into, I think it was Bachapalli, which is one of our schools here in Hyderabad. One of the girls was explaining their project around menstrual health to me, and I was thinking to myself, I'm an ex-science teacher. I've been in schools for 30 odd years, and I don't think I've ever been briefed on a project of that nature. And I was like, what do I say? All I could do was be supportive and say, well, it's fantastic. It's obviously an issue, it's obviously something that was very, very important to this particular group of students, boys and girls, who felt there was something that we should do something about, or something that they should do something about with our help. So, that's sort of what I was referring to earlier in terms of thinking, I've not been put on the spot is not quite the right word, because they weren't asking for any. They weren't going into any sort of territory that would make me uncomfortable. I just thought it was just really interesting that they were more than happy to explain to me what their project was, what the outcomes were, etc.
That's great. And as a mother of a daughter, I really feel glad that students feel empowered enough and they don't feel hesitation in talking about such topics as menstrual health, because that's how the society should be and should evolve. So really happy, that this is happening, and it's very heartening for me as a mother of a daughter. So let's switch gears a little. We covered a lot about your journey so far, how international schools are doing in India, the integration with the local culture, your experiences with students, with stakeholders. And what I want to ask next is, more about education as a whole. So you have been in this, in this industry for over 30 years now. And in these 30 years, what do you think have changed, or what is the core thing that has remained constant? So tell us about your perspective as an outsider. So I'll ask you to step out a little and then look back over these 30 years and tell me, how do you see things changing, and how will it change in future, and what has remained constant?
Well, it's really interesting because there's obviously a lot of talk about AI at the moment, and the various things with that. I think the role of a teacher has remained and will remain, because the core role of a teacher for me is to enthuse, excite, engage their students. Okay. So there's a guy out of the UK called Sir John Jones, and he wrote a book called Magic Weavers. And he's basically about the power of teaching and the fact that teachers light fires under students and get them excited. And he does a really good thing when you hear him speak live. He says, think of a teacher that's changed your life. So you all sit there, and then he says, when you finish this session, contact the teacher and tell them that you changed their life, because obviously we're all guilty of forgetting to give that positive feedback, and it's really powerful. I mean, I've been very lucky actually. I've worked with a few teachers that used to teach me, and so I've had that opportunity. I actually once, believe it or not, I once had to take my ex primary school science teacher for a driving test. He had to drive a minibus around while I assessed him. And I was thinking, this is ridiculous. He was driving me when I was 9 years old. But, anyway, it was rules.
Wow.
It was rules at the time. It was an insurance rule at the time. So I think, teachers will always be there. And, they don't ever appear on these lists of, professions that might disappear because of technology, AI, etc. What has obviously changed is the tools that we have. So as you quite rightly said, I started teaching in the dark end of the 20th century, we literally, when I started teaching, we were still on chalkboards. We didn't have computers, we didn't have email. We were using overhead projectors, so little plastic sheets that we could project things on. We were, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a science teacher, so we were using experiments and things like that to try and engage and excite students. And with the maths, we were using maths problems and trying to make sure that maths was relevant to students. So, obviously over the years, technology's come in and made that much easier. And I remember when computers came into schools, but there was literally a computer and a bag that you could go and pick up a computer, as in what we would call a desktop nowadays, and carry it home for the weekend to use it and then bring it back. I mean, it was just crazy, And then obviously laptops came along. I remember buying my first Apple laptop in 1996, and of course it weighed probably about half as much as I do, and et cetera, et cetera. Then we had interactive whiteboards, and then we've had visualizers, and we've had things coming and going. And then obviously more recently the focus has been about the applications and how we do them, because laptops, tablets, et cetera have become the mainstay. It's now how we use them. So the key for me, though, is that they still have to meet that core objective. They still have to be making teaching more engaging, making sure all of your students are engaged. Because the second thing that's changed in the last 30 years is we understand far better how students learn. We don't stand at the front and present to a whole class. We know that out of a class of 24 students, that some will learn in a certain way, some will be engaged in certain ways, and in other ways, and that's really important. I mentioned earlier, we've got some projects. We've got a research project with Boston College in Massachusetts to sort of do the next phase of that. In terms of really deep diving into how people learn. So for me, one constant and two big changes. And the key then is how we use those changes to keep to that constant, so that a science student in years to come is as excited about learning about atomic structure as my students were when they were learning it from me in 1993. I hope.
Great. I think, that makes perfect sense. So what you're saying is that teacher as a profession, so teachers remain the core of education and that will continue to be. But all the surrounding technology, tools, methodologies that continue to evolve and in the right direction. So with all these new tech, it's teachers are empowered to make classrooms more engaging and personalized, right? So they're not restricted by one model now.
Exactly, and then the other thing that it's a sort of subsection of what I've just said is, of course, at the same time in the tools part of what I've just said, the students have started to become far more skilled in those tools. So in a very simple terms, no student ever used to use a chalkboard or an overhead projector at home. Whereas as soon as we had laptops, maybe not straight away, but within a few years, every child had a laptop. They obviously use phones nowadays, they use tablets. The phrase digital native, comes up. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and the person wrote in and said, "How much time should my child spend watching television?" And the host of the podcast, who makes television for a living, said, "Oh no, don't worry about it." And then obviously acknowledge there are limits, and we do need to train young people to manage these things. But in my experience, I have two children in their 20s. They use technology far healthier than I do. I never off my phone. Whereas I text, WhatsApp my children, and half a day later, "Oh, sorry, my phone was in the bottom of the bag. I was doing this, I was doing that." So I think they've got it by and large. Not that we don't have to manage that, we don't have to introduce that very carefully. But I get very frustrated with teachers or schools. Generally, there's not something that happens in our schools, but where they're trying to get students to use technology in a different way to the way they would use it. So I came across a school recently that allowed their students to bring their laptops in on a Wednesday. And I said to this school, I had to be polite because it was a friend's school, but I was like, but if you said to your teachers, you can only use your laptop on a Wednesday.
On Wednesday.
How would they cope? How would they react? So, I think we've got to be mindful of that. I was in China when the Chinese government banned students bringing phones in. And I sat in meetings with parents who did not look up from their phones asking me, what are we going to do about this? And I went, well, we need your help here because it's, the extension of the phone and extension of what of the family and what happens there. So there's definitely a debate to be had there. But again, I'll go back to what I said. It's around, the evolving tools and using them properly. The last thing I'd say on that bit on technology, and I think we're seeing it with AI coming in now. I think we've learned the where not to go, if you know what I mean. We've 20
That's interesting.
20 years ago, I converted a whole school to a software platform for teaching and learning, and I was so pleased with myself. And then that software platform collapsed 6 months later. And so I've learned to be really cautious. Let's just see. Let's not go with the fads. Let's just see what is lasting, what's going to actually make an impact in terms of our core role, which is exciting enthusiasts and getting outcomes out of students. And so I do think we're much better at that now. And I think the days of limited choice and the days of wonder software, we're all just a little bit more. Let's just have a look at this and just check it's doing what we can. What it says it can do and what we think we need.
Yeah, no, I think the entire ecosystem is becoming far more complex. So there's no one solution to any problem anymore. So the rules of the past the rules of the past don't hold anymore, right? So technology is all pervasive and there are multiple devices, multiple platforms. Students find ways to use technology that teachers and academicians cannot even imagine or think of because they are not digitally native, right? So I think this shift of the mindset for schools and teachers as well on how to use technology, how to use tools, that has become far more complex for them to handle or implement. And something that stood out again, Chris, what you said, that now what doesn't work. And I think that's the right approach. We will not know what works, but we will always know what will not work. So it's the selection by elimination, and that generally works. Yeah. So coming on that, point again on technology and AI. Now, let me talk a little bit more about AI or ask you some questions on that. Because I come from, I moved from education to corporate world, and here AI is, the buzzword these days. And there is a lot of work going on in terms of how workforce will change, how work will change. And I've generally seen that education as an industry moves a little slower or reacts a little slower to any emerging trend. But there's a huge opportunity when you talk about how AI can impact learning.
Yeah.
So what are your views? How have you been using AI in your schools across North Anglia Group, Chris?
It's actually interesting because I would say I'm personally an early adopter, or I was an early, I'm usually the person with the newest iPhone and let's try this. And if I've just made the move from X to Blue Sky in social media because, that's the new shiny thing. I personally think it's a bit better, but, that's obviously subjective. AI, I've been a little bit slow to get into. I think like most people, I did the play with ChatGPT a couple of years ago and, please write a love poem for my wife. And then my wife pointed out I'd never done that before, so it was clearly not my work.
It's clearly not your
and all
work.
the rest of it. But what I have started to see is organisations like the IB embracing AI and saying, well, look, this is something we've got to we can't ban it. We've got to work with it. It's obviously a great tool. Whether that's a great summarizer, whether that's a great research tool, or whatever it would be. And the schools, have they have embraced AI in that spirit. I mean, it's really interesting. About 2 years ago, I wrote to all the schools asking how we were using AI, and all the schools wrote back to me explaining how they were stopping AI. I asked the same question a year later, and I got the answer I was looking for, in terms of, we're using it for this, we're using it for that, partly administration, partly communication, and obviously a lot in the teaching and learning, and platforms such as CoSchool that have come along. The reason I'm a big fan of platforms like CoSchool is because they're working with teachers to make sure it's supporting the work that they do. It's not replacing the teachers. As going back to what I was saying earlier, it's not saying we will not need teachers in the future. It's saying, look, here's something that can help you personalize your education. So you're almost hitting all three of my points earlier. You're hitting the core point of a teacher, which is to engage and infuse, the right use of technology as a tool, and that personalization, because we now know much more about how students learn. And I think that will be, that'll be the direction that we're going in, led by platforms such as CoSchool. So I think the write a poem for your wife, help me write a complaint letter to British Airways, those sorts of things will come and go, I think, and I think I can spot those when I get them. I say to my colleagues, I like brevity. So, please don't stick something in ChatGPT to make it all look like a work of Shakespeare. I just want the bullet points, So, of course, I can then use AI to then turn their prose back into bullet points, but that sort of defeats the object of where they started. But no, I think it's an exciting thing. I was going around 2 years ago saying AI is a fad, and I was laughed at by everybody. And until I explained what I meant. And what I meant was what I've just said. The core, good, sustainable uses of the technology will come out of this, and the periphery and the fads will drop away. And it's happened in every bit of technology, hardware or software, certainly in the last 30 years that I've come along. There's all sorts of examples of things that have come and gone away again, and then there's things that have kept with us. Some of the most powerful tools I find, in terms of technology, are ones that allow collaboration. So, something as simple as Teams or SharePoint or Google the Google Suite, within their framework. They're just really powerful, and they of course are now also enhanced by AI. I think sometimes we sometimes in the world of technology, we rush to the shiny new things, and in fact,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
the simple stuff, or the applications of simple stuff, or the adding on to the simple stuff that actually makes the impact day in, day out. It's quite sad. When I'm going back to the question you asked me earlier, when I'm feeling a little bit office bound, a little bit like my job is to sit here, on my computer plodding away, I'm still 99% of the time using Excel and Word, which is not changed in 25 years.
Exactly.
Yes, it looks much nicer, and yes, it's quicker, and yes, I can now share it directly with other people and collaborate and everything I said just now. But it is still basically the same thing. So yeah, I'm cautiously, more than cautiously optimistic that we'll find the right route, and platforms such as CoSchool will go in the right direction because they're still supporting the teacher to do their core role.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense, Chris. And as you rightly said, that there's a lot of buzz around it because we like to chase that shiny object. But I think now the dust is settling, and we are seeing real business case emerging, real scalable solutions being implemented using AI across industries, including education. And these, edtech companies like CoSchool, they play a very important role because schools can't do everything on their own. They need support in terms of these tech players who can help them implement technology in a better way and in a seamless way. So, glad that you found that mix, and it's helping you in implementing technology and empowering your teachers. So teachers remain at the heart of education, and they're empowered to deliver a more engaged and personalized education to their students. So I think that makes perfect sense.
I think it's great, and I think whenever I go to an education conference or an exhibition, and as you can imagine, you get inundated with people, showing you their wares. And the first question I always ask is, well, what's the background of this organisation? And if it's come out of a set of students, and there's a couple of really good examples of this, who have come up with something while they were at school because it was helping them get through the IB or something like that. That's obviously fantastic because that's something that is proved, and there's a great bit of software that we use in all of our schools called ManageBack, and that's exactly its history. It came out of a group of students going, we need some help to manage the IB because the IB is relatively not complicated, but there are lots of moving parts to it. My second criteria is, yes, you're absolutely right. Teachers cannot do it alone, but I do want to see some evidence that they've got some teachers or somebody with an education background with that. Where I get really nervous is where you've got, a large organisation that's just gone, I see, there's a new market, we can do that, And as I say, going back to CoSchool, not to labour that point too much, but they've got somebody who's got lifelong interest in working in education, working with people who have been teaching and being more directly involved, and that is for me is the best combination, or at least the second best combination after my interested student model I said earlier. So.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And if you have founders who have a good grounding in understanding the education space because of their experience, that makes the best combination of any edtech company in this space, working with schools,
Sure.
Especially because schools is a different, being altogether. It's a different body,
Yeah.
and it needs an understanding how they operate to be able to serve them. So that makes perfect sense, Chris, what you just said. I have a different question now. We spoke about use of technology in education. We spoke about the emerging ecosystem that is helping schools. Any suggestion that you have for parents in terms of using AI for their own kids, or any concerns that you have seen, any challenges that you have seen in when you're interacting with parents, or questions that come up? So what would be your advice to parents these days struggling to understand AI and their impact on their kids' life?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, because I think, and we sort of touched on it earlier when we talked about the different speeds that maybe students and staff sometimes work at. For a parent has to be, and obviously the school has to help facilitate that, but the parent has to be open to lots of the things that I've been saying today. Their children will be learning in a different way to the way they learnt. They will obviously be using different tools. And so, making sure they're briefed on that, making sure they're comfortable with that, and making sure they know how to support, different forms of homework, because, traditional homework isn't necessarily, it might have worked perfectly well 30, 40 years ago, but, because of what we've just been talking about, there are so many better uses of time or better ways of framing that sort of work. Something like homework, I think is useful for certain ages. Research, it varies a little bit in terms of its usefulness, but it does obviously help provide a certain discipline, a certain practical way of setting up for the next day or whatever it might be. But it also helps engage the parents, and the parents can get involved and see what things are doing. So no, parents just need to be open to what's there. They need to be making sure they're aware of the school's guidelines on the use of technology, for example. They need to have a clear idea of what their own guidelines are on the use of technology at home, which I touched on earlier. I remember working with a colleague years ago who had very strict rules on when his children, this is his own children, can get onto Wi-Fi. It's not something I ever did as a parent, but that doesn't make me right and them wrong, or vice versa. But you just need to be comfortable with what we're doing. But I think the thing for me is we this is what we find with our parents here. Our parents are working, especially in Hyderabad and Bangalore. They're working in the tech sector. They're working globally. They're working all sorts of different hours. They can only do that, and they can only thrive in that if they're using technology, which recently includes AI, to make their life as not as easy as possible, but as manageable as possible. And so I think that will always be a job for schools to explain approaches, curricula, whatever it might be, where children are then going on to study, because that's often new for parents. Certainly in my last job in China, we were generally sending the first member of the family overseas to university, and that requires a certain sort of preparation, certain sort of approaches. But yeah, so to go back to your original question, parents open-minded and take up the offers of the school to guide them through those changes in those processes.
Yeah. So I have seen my daughter use, ChatGPT and other tools very extensively for research, especially for MUNs. So she does a lot of research, takes help in writing her speeches, and I use it to draft questions for her to make her practice, let's say, math or science. So these are the ways that, we have been using. But I agree, it's a mind shift change again, because for parents, the way we have grown up are, there used to be limits on screen time, because screen time meant TV time. But now screen time means so much more. The definition has changed, right? So if a child is watching a video or, doing research using his or her laptop, do you count that as screen time, or do you not count that as screen time? As you rightly said, that, parenting styles will vary. Everyone will have their own preferences, but keeping an open mind to how technology is impacting education will really help everyone. All right. So, Chris, we spoke about multiple things, a lot of topics we covered in this short conversation. I have one last question for you. You have worked across multiple countries. You have handled or worked with parents from different, origins and ethnicities. You work with teachers across. According to you, which country has the naughtiest children?
I have to say, it's 20 years of running schools and now running groups of schools. I've never been asked that question before. So it's a really interesting question. Now, just to be the teacher in me, we obviously say that it's the behaviour that's naughty. It's not the child that's naughty. But to come back, what I've found, I've been to, let me just quickly add this up. I've been to schools either as a student, a teacher, or principal or managing director in 11 different countries. I've found probably more that keeps and sorry, of those 11 countries, I wouldn't know how many nationalities I've then either been in the classroom with or taught with, etc. What I have found is there's one common behaviour in all students of a certain age around the world, and that is the answer to the question from parents of an evening, what did you do at school today? And 99% of children around the world will say nothing. I used to have this joke with my children where they were that sort of age, and they now read it back to me, even though they're now in their 20s. So I'd say, what did you do at school today? Nothing. Why do I pay my fees? And you can imagine the rest of the conversation. So no, I don't think I could single out one nationality. Certainly, where certainly in the last three, or certainly China and here, you have parent bodies that are very invested in education. They really want the best and for their children, and that's not me saying that other countries don't want that, but they're prepared in both those countries and Vietnam to make quite significant sacrifices to send their child to private school or whatever set up was within their means. And they're very engaged with their parents, their children's learning. And those are environments where you probably get the best behaviour or the least naughtiness, because everybody's pulling in the same sort of direction and doing that, which is great. I get asked a lot. I've been interviewed by a few radio stations here in India, and I get asked a lot to compare Chinese parents to Indian parents. And I find it a fascinating question, because there are 1.4 billion Chinese people and 1.4 billion Indian people. And
Indian parents.
And I think, if my maths is correct, that's about 34% of the world. And you're thinking, how do I compare those two bodies? But I say I've touched on something they've all got in common. What I do find about Indian parents is they are really focused on the fact that education has to be much more about academic outcomes and grades. They know, especially those that their children are going to go, overseas to university, they know they've got to build those skills. They know that if they land in Boston or Oxford or, Paris or wherever it might be, they've got to have those skills. So I've successfully avoided your question, but hopefully given you something richer in terms of my feelings on parents and how they approach education across the world.
I'm just happy you didn't say India, because that makes me feel better about being a parent, and totally align with you, on that question. What did you do in the school? I have been experimenting with various versions of that question, and have never got a satisfactory answer from my daughter. What works is bribing. So if I bribe her with something, tell me something about your day and I'll feed you ice cream today. And then I get to know that she killed at the basketball court, got scolded by the coordinator, failed in some tests. So all that happened in a day, which was originally nothing happened.
Obviously, in the school world, we wouldn't call that bribery. We'd call that incentivization.
Yeah, I positively incentivize her to tell me about her day.
Exactly. Good. It doesn't change, by the way. If I ring my children in their 20s and go, "How was your day?" you still get the same thing, or they're both working and they're both doing very different things. So sadly, that doesn't change. So unless there's something to tell you, or they need money. So
I think fundamentally, children across the world are the same. But great having you on this session today, Chris, and great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you had a great time too.
We've hit some topics that I could talk for hours on. I am a huge fan of and I'm fascinated by global mobility and what we talked about earlier in terms of what can international company Nord Anglia bring to a large country like India. As you know, my own country has been so much enriched by global interactions and the communities that we have there. I'm passionate about the power of teachers and how well they do. I love my technology, but as I say, I've learned the hard way, both personally and professionally, in terms of how we do that. So no, thank you. It's been great to have the opportunity to talk to you on these topics.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, and have a great day and
Thank you.
even awesome weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.